All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome on into the Auburn Daily Show, episode 28 of the Auburn Daily Show on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon here in Auburn, Alabama. Lance Daw here with you. Really appreciate y'all tuning in today. If you're not following us already, go ahead and follow us over on our socials at SI_Auburn on Twitter. I'd also encourage you to follow us on Facebook as well if you're not already watching there. Live streaming every single weekday starting at 4 p.m. Central on Facebook, on YouTube, and Twitch. All right. Got a couple interesting topics for the show today. Whenever I say a couple, I quite literally mean two, because one of them is as always, stat of the day, but the other one probably going to take a little bit longer to get through. And that would be SEC power rankings. Now, you may be asking yourself, Lance, why are we doing SEC power rankings in the offseason? Well, this is post-spring. I have not had the opportunity to discuss post-SEC post-spring stuff yet. So I figured I'd go ahead and do that today, kind of give my SEC power rankings, kind of give my thoughts on where teams are at heading into the offseason. Going to talk about, where Auburn sits in this. Should be fun. Should be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get into it. At the top, should we start at the bottom or should we start at the top? Let's start at the top. At the top of my SEC power rankings, and this is post-spring after getting to see what these teams had to offer during their spring camps. Team at the top is Alabama. I don't really think there's a lot of disagreement there. I think the most important thing for the Crimson Tide this spring, this offseason, and during fall camp is kind of re-solidifying that offensive line. Definitely sketchy at times last season. It's not the best place to be for Heisman-winning quarterback Bryce Young. Alabama gave up over 40 sacks this past season, which was the third most out of any Power 5 school, which is just an insane statistic whenever you think about it's Alabama. But I think the Crimson Tide are going to be able to do a little bit better than they were last season. I mean, they picked up a Vanderbilt transfer in Tyler Sheen, who's probably going to, I actually don't know where he's going to start. He's a little flexible based on what I've read. But yeah, I think the most important thing for Alabama this offseason was just reworking that offensive line, trying to get Jahmyr Gibbs involved. We got to see him in the spring game, really talented running back, transfer from Georgia Tech. He's going to be a weapon for Bryce Young this season. So just trying to retool some things around the Heisman-winning quarterback. The defense, I think, is going to be a little bit better than it was last season, and last season it was excellent. Will Anderson, who should have been in New York for the Heisman ceremony, will be back for the Crimson Tide this season after having a phenomenal year last year. Yeah, so there's not really a whole lot going wrong for Alabama. I mean, the offensive line is the question mark. But I think it's one of those things where it's like it's Alabama. I have a feeling they're going to find a way to reload there. I have a feeling. The second team here on the SEC power rankings, again, post-spring, is Georgia. Now, I know that the Bulldogs have just recently won the national title. I know that they've got some guys coming back. They've got their quarterback coming back. Brock Bowers, who had 15 touchdown catches this past season, probably going to be the biggest target for Stetson Bennett. And then they've also got a couple of other receivers like Eric Gilbert is going to be actually playing finally. They've got some interesting pieces. Got to see Eric Gilbert in the spring game. But the question here with Georgia is can they sustain success after getting over the hump? And I think there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that, yes, there's a good chance that they will, or yes, they will this season. But at the same time, They only beat Alabama one of the two times that they played. Of course, it was in the national title, more important than the SEC championship game, but they're not far and above the Alabama Crimson Tide right now. They're on the same playing field. And so my question is, just based off of history, based off of Georgia's track record up until this point where they won the national title, can they assert themselves against a team that they are not significantly more talented than? Especially considering that they just had 15 players drafted, if I'm not mistaken, something ridiculous like that. They've got some pieces that are departing the program. How they reload is the question. Now, I believe that they will. I believe that they have enough talent on roster to reload. It's just, will it be like what Alabama has done in the past? And I don't know. So I've got them at number 2, even though I think you could definitely make the case that they should be number 1. At number 3, and I struggled with this one for a little bit, Texas A&M. And you looked at Texas A&M's quarterback performances during the spring game. None of them were particularly impressive. Haynes King, Max Johnson, Connor Weigman, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Quite frankly, I don't care. They will be competing for the starting quarterback job. Curious to see who wins that. Would probably be leaning Weigman or Max Johnson there, but neither of them I think really jump off the page. Jimbo Fisher has a lot of confidence in Connor, the true freshman, but we'll just have to see what happens there. But yeah, I think that one of the things that held the Aggies back at times last season, considering they had such a stout defense, was the quarterback play. And you can say what you want about the offensive line. I think that it overachieved based on the injuries and the struggles that they had. And they had a lot of really good skill position players, specifically in their backfield. And at times, Zach Calzada couldn't execute. He's here with Auburn now. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, I think that Texas A&M has enough talent to be worthy of this third ranking, this third spot on the post-SEC power rankings, despite the fact that they've got some question marks there at quarterback. They certainly have some question marks. At number 4, I have Ole Miss. Man, Ole Miss had some players get drafted. They had some players depart, some players graduate. And then Lane Kiffin went out and just got about everybody and their mother in the transfer portal. Just said, you know what? You're coming with me. And guess what? Your parents are coming too. Come on down to the SIP. They've literally reloaded at all 3, I think, major positions, receiver, at least on the offensive side of the ball. Now they've gotten some interesting defensive pieces. Like they got, I believe, Ladarius Tennyson from Auburn and J.J. Begees from Auburn as well. But they got a quarterback in Jackson Dart. They got a couple of running backs, and they got some receivers. Curious to see what this team does in 2022. Because while those guys may have performed, while these transfers may have performed well at their previous schools, I'm curious to see if Lane Kiffin can kind of, I don't know, they went 10-3 last year. Can he get all of these transfers to perform at a 10-3 level in the SEC again? I think it's a question that you have to ask. But yeah, those guys looked good. Those guys look good right now. Curious to see what the Rebels do in 2022. At number 5, I have Arkansas. Arkansas at number 5. And we've talked about the Hogs recently on the show. Talked about how it could potentially be the trap game on Auburn's schedule. It's really difficult for it to be a trap game if it's a top 5 team in the conference. But hear me out right now. So this is preseason. They've got their quarterback back. They've got some interesting pieces on the defense now. And so preseason, with Oklahoma transfer Jadon Hazelwood transferring in, wide receiver there, I think it's going to be interesting to see how Arkansas handles themselves after arguably overachieving in 2021. So I'm leaving the door open for the opportunity for Arkansas to kind of replicate what they did last season. Maybe go 8-4, maybe go 9-4. But I think, in my personal opinion, that their schedule is so difficult, it's going to be really tough to get to that 9-win mark again. So I think preseason, it's fair to say Arkansas has the opportunity to be a decent team. I think they could be a top 5 team in the SEC based on their spring performance. I've got them at 5. But but if we're going to walk through the schedule and predict some games here, I think they may be 1 or 2 spots lower on this list. But again, this is preseason. This is not a postseason projection. This is preseason. Heading into the season, where are they at as a team? At number 6, I have Tennessee. And Tennessee also picked up a couple interesting pieces in the transfer portal. I believe they just recently got Brew McCoy, if I'm not mistaken, wide receiver out of USC, who was formerly at Texas, then at USC, and it's just a weird situation. But a former 5-star guy, underrated in the chat. War Eagle to you as well, my friend. But yeah, Tennessee's got some interesting pieces. They also have somebody that I think should be squarely in the Heisman conversation in Hendon Hooker. 31 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. I've seen some people on social media, they have differing opinions about Hendon Hooker, and here's my stance on him. I've seen several people say, well, how many of those touchdowns did he throw against legitimate competition? And how much of his performance last season were against defenses that were legitimate? And so I went and did a little digging. As it turns out, he played more top 50 defenses than Bryce Young did. And I think he threw the exact same amount of touchdown passes that Bryce Young did against top 50 competition. And whenever I say top 50 total, I mean top 50 teams that were, teams that were in the top 50 in total defense. That's total yards per game. So he faced some decent defenses, and he threw, I think it was 22 of his 31 touchdowns against those defenses, if I'm not mistaken. It was 1 or 2 more games than Bryce Young had. But my point being is that he is a good quarterback. It's a good system. It's explosive. It's high octane. It's exciting football at Tennessee. Is it sustainable? We'll just have to see. But the Vols looked good coming out of spring, so I've got them at 6th. At number 7, I have LSU. And I think that we talked about this on yesterday's show. It's like, well, Brian Kelly's a good coach, but they got so much turmoil. They had so much turmoil before Kelly walked into the program. I'm just curious to see how quickly can he get this team off the ground, right? Now, they've got a lot of talent, and they're going to bring in some talent. They've got an interesting quarterback battle, Jaden Daniels, transferring in from Arizona State. How does he fare against Garrett Nussmeier and Miles Brennan? That's going to be something to watch down there. But I've got him at 7 because I do think that talent that they have is going to kind of boost them in areas where the coaching staff or maybe just the turmoil may affect them. But at the same time, I don't know if it's fair preseason to have them ranked much higher than this. And so I've got them at 7. That's just where I stand on LSU. It's kind of a wait and see for me. Even though I like the potential, it's kind of a wait and see. At number 8, I have Kentucky. Kentucky, they've got some interesting pieces on that on the offensive side of the ball. Got a really solid offensive line again, I think. Will Levis is back for another year. He was like a top 5 quarterback in a mock draft recently, like going like 7th or 8th overall. It was something crazy next season. But Will Levis is back. They've got a Wan'Dale Robinson replacement and Tavion Robinson transfer from Virginia Tech. Chris Rodriguez, their star running back, is back. The secondary, I think, is a little bit of a question mark, especially at cornerback. They've got a little depth there. Been trying to add some guys in the transfer portal. Keydron Smith, Jordan Robinson, a Division II transfer. They've added to that secondary. I think that's the biggest question mark on this team, but the team's going to score points. Kentucky will score points in 2022. The question is it going to be enough to get them back to 10 wins? And I don't know. All I know is that they get Georgia at home, and if Georgia is not as polished at the end of the season, which is when they play Kentucky, if they're not as polished as they were this past season, that's going to be a dogfight in Lexington, at least in my opinion. Now, Kentucky could be rated higher on this list. It's just their spring stuff just didn't really impress, and their secondary was a little injured, but at the same time, it was all over the place. So I don't feel comfortable bumping them up much higher than this. You could make an argument for 7, and I think that would be just fine. At number 9, I have Florida. The only reason I have the Gators this high is because Anthony Richardson looked so good. He looked so good in the spring game. And they've also got a couple of guys coming in from the transfer portal. Probably going to be adding a lot more names throughout the spring. Going to be interesting to see the guys that they add to this team. Got a couple of offensive linemen already. They got to so Billy Napier, the head coach formerly of Louisiana Lafayette. They got the starting running back for the Raging Cajuns, Montrell Johnson, who ran for almost 850 yards and 12 touchdowns last season, got him to transfer to the Gators. This is actually something we were talking about recently on the show. Like, when's the last time Florida had like a legitimate rushing attack outside of this season where they had a bunch of different guys, but they've never had like a bell cow back. They've never had like that one guy in the backfield that really scares you, at least for a long time. And you could go back to the Tim Tebow days, but like he was a quarterback. Some people would say running back, whatever. But yeah, Florida at number 9. I'm really excited to see what Anthony Richardson does. I've said this over and over and over on ESPN radio, and I'll say it here. And I could be completely off on this, but this is just my thought. He looks like a baby Dak Prescott out there. That's what he looks like to me. It's what he reminds me of. I think he can blossom into something special if he's given the right circumstance. I am very intrigued with the situation down in Florida, and I'm very intrigued to see if this coaching staff can unlock his potential if he does end up starting, which I believe that he will. At number 10, I have Auburn. Some people would have Auburn lower. I'm biased, so I'm going to put the Tigers at number 10. The quarterback battle is not something that you're particularly excited about. It's a room full of mid, according to some of the social media members out there. It's a room full of mid, according to some media members, I should say. But I will say, we've talked about it before here on the show. I think Brian Harsin and his team is slightly underrated. He said it himself. I think a lot of people just kind of brushed them off, just kind of discounted them after what happened earlier this spring between Harsin and the athletic department. You've got to be able to give this group a little bit more time to see if they can make something happen. And I think that this year it would just be absolutely perfect if they exceeded expectations and they were able to go out there and win some games that they shouldn't. There wasn't anything particularly terrible about the spring, and there was nothing particularly terrible about the spring game, except I don't like the way that it's done. I personally don't like the way that Auburn has done their spring games under Harsin, but that's neither here nor there. My point being is that there's nothing terrible, but there was nothing like particularly great either, other than the fact that I'm really excited about this defensive line. But yeah, that's where I stand on Auburn. I think 10 is fair. You could put them at 9, but I've seen several power rankings out there where they're low on people's lists. At number 11, I have Mississippi State. Look, I'm excited about Will Rogers again. I'm excited about what this defense is going to do again under Zach Arnett. Underrated unit from last year, especially stopping the run. They were like one of the best teams in the nation in stopping the run last season, which I did not realize until doing a little research. I think the special teams unit is a huge question mark for Mississippi State. If they can get kicking down, this team is probably going to win a game that they would have last year. They're going to win a game this year against an opponent that they probably should have last year. And I'm thinking about Arkansas there. But yeah, they I believe they actually went and got somebody in the transfer portal, if I'm not mistaken, to potentially kick for them. But yeah, I'm excited to see what Will Rogers does. How does Mike Leach continue to grow in the SEC with his air raid offense? Does it take a slight step back? I don't know. We'll just have to see. But yeah, Mississippi State at 11. South Carolina at 12. I think the only true redeeming factor here is the fact that Shane Beamer is just so likable. And then on top of that, Spencer Rattler's here, somebody that really is not likable, at least in the college football sphere. I don't have that opinion of him. I've seen that opinion out there on social media. But the Gamecocks, they got some pieces. So they added Christian Beal-Smith, who's a transfer running back from Wake Forest. They added Corey Rucker from Arkansas State, who Auburn fans should know, as he was a target of the Tigers. They added Antoine Wells from James Madison, a receiver. And then they added Austin Stogner who is a tight end from Oklahoma, just like Spencer Rattler. They've got some pieces, it looks like. Looks like they've got some pieces. The question is whether or not they'll be able to actually execute. I'll say this. If their offense looks anything like what they were doing in the bowl game, as far as aggressively attacking downfield, this is going to be a fun team to watch. If it isn't, I mean, and they can get to a bowl. They can certainly get into a bowl. But right now, just I don't want to jump the gun on South Carolina because I'm not sure what the talent and the depth looks like with this team just yet. But Shane Beamer in year one, I mean, you got to be happy with what he's done. And I think that people are going to be rooting for him, or at least most people are going to be rooting for him. At number 13, I have Missouri. The only thing that I can say about Missouri is that Luther Burden looked good. 5-star wide receiver. I think he's going to get a lot of passes thrown his way. I think the question here is who's going to be throwing to him. Is it going to be Brady Cook? Is it going to be somebody else? Connor Bazelak transferred to Indiana. Jaden Daniels did not end up going to Missouri after there were rumors there. JT Daniels transferred from Georgia. I believe ended up signing with the West Virginia Mountaineers after some Oregon State smoke. But yeah, Missouri, I'm not particularly high on Missouri, and I don't think that Eli Drinkwitz is a bad coach. I actually kind of like his personality. I know it turns some people off. I think it's kind of entertaining. It's just, this is a tough year in the league, and I think this is one of those teams that might get left behind. Watch them go like 8-4 or something, and I just have to eat my words here. And the last team is Vanderbilt. All I'm going to say about Vanderbilt is that they tied their spring game 32-all. They can't even win a spring game. The Vanderbilt Commodores. Good on them and Clark Lee. All right. I want to get into the statistic of the day here. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends at AU Shirts. AUshirts.com is the one-stop shop to flex your Auburn fandom. Got some awesome designs out right now. As you can see on the ticker, a quote from Blake Burkhalter. I don't actually know if that's a quote from Blake Burkhalter. It might have been just a quote from our good friend Zach Blackerby. But Blake has a really cool shirt out right now with a backwards K in closing time. Awesome stuff. I actually don't know if he's 100% for this series against Arkansas. You can go check out our preview of Auburn versus Arkansas over at auburndaily.com. But yeah, a ton of different Auburn merch over at AUshirts.com. A lot of different player designs. They've also got Auburn Daily merch. Mine should be here soon. Excited to share that with you guys. And right now, you can actually go over to AUshirts.com and you can use promo code DAILY and get yourself 10% off your order. Again, you can go to AUshirts.com, use promo code DAILY whenever you go to checkout and get 10% off your order. Would highly encourage you guys to check them out. All right. To kind of wrap up the show here, we've got the stat of the day. The question here is, can Auburn's offense improve on the numbers that they put out last season? Now, we've talked already about this on this show about over-unders and about whether or not Auburn's going to be able to have more rushing yards, passing yards, points per game, different things like that. But the statistic of the day here is this. In 2020, Auburn averaged 25.1 points per game. In 2021, the Tigers averaged 28.3 points per game. And here's what that statistic means. Despite criticism surrounding Auburn's offense this past season, the Tigers still managed to average 3.2 more points than they did in 2020. There's reason here to believe that Auburn's offense is going to take another step in the right direction in 2022. But here's something to keep in mind, and I noted this over on our Stat of the Day article at auburndaily.com. Auburn didn't play well against legitimate competition last season. In fact, a third of their scoring production, 1/3 of Auburn's entire 2021 scoring production came in the first two games of the season against Akron and Alabama State. They've got to find ways to put the ball in the end zone against SEC opponents more often. A lot of that, I think, is going to come back to what they do in the run game and how they utilize Tank Bigsby. He's the best offensive player that you have, at least on paper right now. Find ways to get him the ball. Also want to note about Auburn's receiver corps. So our friends over at the War Report, they've been doing some player interviews recently. I'd encourage you to go check their channel out, but they've been doing some player interviews recently. And I think there is a misconception out there that Auburn does not have a ton of talent in the receiver room. I think they've got a lack of experience, but I think they've got talent. They've had some guys on the show recently. They just had Jay Fair on, and they've had a couple quarterbacks on. And I just got to say, I think there's a lot of speed in this room. I think there's a lot of speed in the wide receiver room, which excites me. You want to go learn more about that, I'd encourage you to go check out the War Report. But yeah, I think Auburn's receiver room's a little underrated, and combine that with the fact that I've got very high expectations for him. I mean, that's a recipe for success, at least in my mind. It may not be for reality, but in my mind, I'm excited about that. Auburn is underrated, and for good reason. Underrated says in the chat. Have to improve recruiting pitches. I agree with that. If they don't get talent at offensive line and wide receiver in the portal, the staff must produce with what they have, but I remain optimistic. I don't know if Auburn's going to be getting an offensive lineman in the portal. And to be honest with you, if they don't get Ricky Pearsall from Arizona State, which we talked about here on the show, I hate to say this, but I don't know if I see them getting a wide receiver either. If they get an offensive lineman right now, how do you tell one of these 5th year, 6th year seniors to just like, well, you're going to be competing for your spot after we essentially begged you to come back? And I agree, underrated. I think Auburn has to get some talent at offensive line. They need talent. They need some extra guys at receiver. I mean, they've got talent at receiver, but if they could get some experience at receiver is what I would say. So they've got to get those two positions locked down. Of course, I just don't know if they will, or if I don't know if they can this offseason. Now, I want them to. I think it's going to be difficult, though. But yeah, something else I also want to note here is like sometimes generic stats like 28.3 points per game, they don't tell the entire story about something, right? Like hidden within one overarching stat, there can be several peaks and valleys with little individual points in history that might be surprising or disappointing, to like specifically on their own. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter if the overarching stat is what's heavily focused on. I wrote about that at auburndaily.com. And so my point being is like you can look at 28.3 points per game and say, well, that's a 3.2 step in the right direction, 3.2 point step in the right direction. But I think the more important thing here is focusing on scoring against conference opponents. Talked about the schedule. We've beaten the schedule to death on this show, and goodness gracious, it's only May 4th. May the 4th be with you, by the way. It's only May 4th, but we're going to continue to beat this schedule to death throughout the rest of the offseason. But guys, you get to group of 5 schools. One of them's an FCS school to begin the season. You got to win those 2 games. You got to put points on the board. Then you play Penn State. I think you got to put Penn State on notice. You got to drop at least 31. I think on that team, you've got to drop at least 31. I have question marks about what they're going to do in the trenches this season. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Establish your run game. You were averaging over 4.5 yards per carry against them last season. Establish that this year. You're at home. Make them work. Okay, drop points on them. Then you get Missouri, one of the worst rush defenses in the entire nation last year. Run them into the ground. You have the opportunity to do that, at least on paper. I would take advantage of it, or at least attempt to. And then finally, LSU, they've got so much talent. I don't know what they're going to do this season. I don't know what their ceiling is. But what I can tell you is that they had, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, they had so much turmoil. I don't know. I'm curious to see what they do. So I think Auburn has to be able to take advantage of that situation, especially given the fact that it's only like 4 or 5 games into the season. And you get all those games at home. I mean, there's no reason why Auburn shouldn't build every single week, get better every single week offensively, and be prepared to take on the rest of the SEC slate. Underrated says the 2023 class has to reload without question. And I agree. And I think they're trying to do that. I mean, they've already gotten Braden Joyner, right, out of Auburn, like the high school. That is. And they're looking at a ton of different offensive linemen right now, like a ton of different guys on the recruiting trail. We've said it before on this show. The question being, can they actually pick one of those guys up? I don't know. Now, if something comes up, we'll talk about it on the show. But until they actually do it, it's just fingers crossed, hoping that they actually make it happen. But yeah. All right, there's your stat of the day. There's your SEC power rankings. And actually, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Auburn Daily Show. You can follow us on Twitter at SI_Auburn. You can also follow us on Facebook at Auburn Daily. Underrated also says Auburn must take advantage of all the home games. I agree. Like Texas A&M, getting to play Texas A&M at home is huge. That is a huge game because the perception will be that Texas A&M is a really good team, but they didn't score an offensive touchdown against Auburn last season. And I don't think their quarterback situation is much better than it was in 2021. So the question is, can they really beat Auburn and Jordan-Hare if Auburn starts out the season like 4-1? At that point, whenever they do play A&M eventually, I don't know. You also have to get the games like against Arkansas. Like, you got to be able to execute there. But anyway. All right. That's going to do it, guys. I will see you all tomorrow for another episode of the Auburn Daily Show. Hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon, and God bless.